Hi everyone, it's Jerry. I have an excellent game to share with you from the 11th and final round of the 2024 Chess Olympiad. On the white end, Vladimir Fedoseev, Team Slovenia, up against Gukesh D, Team India. Okay, let's see how Gukesh handles the London system. This, in my opinion, is a model game against the London system. Let's see what Gukesh's setup is going to be exactly. All right, things are looking good for Team Black. Has the bishop outside of the pawn chain. There's a pin present, and the c-pawn got to c5 in one move. I'm emphasizing one move because this setup here for Black is one you might describe as an accelerated Caro-Kann. Now, White continues here with Queen a4, tries to put some quick pressure on Black, throws the knight in a pin, tries to put that extra move to work. If White doesn't try and play in this way, plays in a slower fashion, Black could never really be worse. Now, I know in general, the side here playing the London system isn't really looking for a whole lot, looking for a slower game, just some playable game, and looking to maybe outplay Black in the long run. I'm pointing this out, this idea of White putting quick pressure on Black, because if you play in a slower way, here's what Black could say. How am I worse? If you consider the pieces and pawns that have already played a role at this stage, you look at the king knights and say they offset. The queen bishops, both are active. King pawns, third rank, fourth rank. What am I getting at? You look at these guys. This is where there's a difference. Black's queen knight is a tick better. Black's c-pawn, a tick better. Fourth rank versus third rank. Two options versus one. So important to maybe put some pressure on Black. We have a pin in this game. What to do about it? Gukesh breaks the pin, anticipates knight e5, puts his knight in position to immediately capture on that square. If you don't play in that way, let's say you ignore this pin and carry on with kingside development, you could easily end up in some hot water as Black here. Computers suggest at this point just castle and give up a pawn. What would be the problem if you try and hang on to c6? Let's see. Well, queen defends, rook defends. This position right here, believe it or not, is already considered winning for White. The queen will soon be kicked away from defending c6. If you take on c4, you're inviting the knight into c4. Queen has to go from c6. And if you castle, there's c5. Queen once more kicked from c6. So Gukesh immediately in this game sniffs out any quick pressure on the c6 knight with knight to e5 by breaking the pin. At the same time, this move leaves the bishop unprotected, so this could be a tactical liability to be sure. There's just a couple pieces that need to be cleared out, and there you go, queen takes bishop is there. Follow up now, bishop b5, how to defend c6. Queen c8, queen b6. In the game, Gukesh goes to c8. If you go to this more active square, what might be the issue? Well, after knight e5 and this capture, White would have this funny looking move. You don't have to immediately recapture. You can capture on c5, and this is maybe a reason to not go to the b6 square. c8, White wouldn't have this fancy move in this position. If you try and defend the knight here, White would still be able to capture on e5. And after the queen recaptures on e5, c6 would end up collapsing. Possible fork in the end. And if you take on c5, here you go. Those two, the pawn and bishop, have officially been cleared from the fourth rank, and there you go. We got 1, 2 threats all of a sudden So in order to sidestep this type of line, Gukesh puts the queen on c8, stays out of reach of the d pawn. From here, rook c1. If white tries knight e5 here, we're just capturing. No problems, no fancy capture on c5 here. We could just back the knight off. Okay, in this game, it's rook c1. Now, if you're not careful now as black, this queen could be in some trouble opposite the rook. White is clearly gearing up now for c4. Okay, let's get the queens off. That might be a good strategy, and that's what we have in this one. a6 takes on c6. There you go. The queen is not a tactical liability. She's watching from the sidelines here, and 11 moves in. Computer says equal, but I believe black can already have his eye on maybe obtaining an advantage. After all, do have the bishop pair and a well-supported center, not really behind so much with development. White continues with c4. Pretty much have to play c4 if you're going to try and justify rook c1. The c file will open up now. Let me throw this position to you as a pop quiz. How would you continue here? What would be your next move? Feel free to pause the video. Okay, an excellent multi-purpose move. Top, in the computer's eyes, f6. Taming the knight to a certain degree, the bishop as well. And we have a pocket for the king. We don't want a castle in this position. No queens on board. We don't have to worry about king safety in this situation. We want to go to f7, where we're a hair closer to the action. White's reply here is knight b3. Computer's not so much a fan of this, prefers castles. The knight b3 move ends up backfiring on white, ends up just getting kicked a few moves from now, simply returns to d2, so not really a whole lot is gained by white in playing in this way. Okay, knight b3 it is in this one, and now comes a5, a defensive and offensive move, you may say. Defensive in that it now prevents knight a5 ideas, and we're looking forward to giving him a kick. All right, from here, white plays h3. Now, there's an important line to have a look at, one where white ends up winning a pawn. I'm going to map out several moves, and at the end of this line, I'm going to really try and drill home the point that this bishop pair here can really turn out to be a nightmare for Team White. How might this look if white goes in for the win of a pawn? The computer at this moment, and even the next move for white, is suggesting this capture on d5, and then this follow-up idea, capture on c5. White is up a pawn with this line, has a passed pawn. However, look at this. After e5, this structure now kills both minor pieces. They are out of play. From here, black can now go after the c pawn. So it may look something like this. White is there in time to defend, right? Well, hang on. The bishops are around. All of a sudden, the c pawn can be targeted for a third time. You want to hang on to him? You're going to have to move him, but if you do, there you go. Killer bees. The rook is trapped. Okay, so we do not have, backing up here, we do not have this sequence, a chop and another chop. It's h3 instead. Bishop f5 has an eye on d3, so knight h4 here, and that would be silly. Bishop has a square, you'd just be asking for a follow-up fork. King e2, guarding bishop d3, but now comes a4. Knight goes back to d2, so this is what I was talking about, the knight b3 back to d2. It's not like white can say, well, now that I've provoked your a pawn to a4, I'm going to take advantage of it. There's no taking advantage of this. This is a positive for black, clamping down on b3. It may one day make a rook b8 move that much more effective. Not at the moment, but eventually this pressure on b2 can be difficult to parry with the pawn on a4. Okay, from here, now we take some care over the light square bishop against knight h4. Bishop g3, getting some developing moves in here. King, right where he wants to be, f7. The rook wants to eventually go to c8. We don't care if it has to go from the h8 or f8 square. The king, what we do know, the king wants to be closer to the center. So king f7 it is. White doubles, watching over the c-pawn. Now the tension is released. On c5, no immediate recapture. So I really like this follow-up move. He plays e5 straight away. Cuts out any possibility of knight to d4. In fact, if we just look at the structure here for black, these guys here in particular, these 4 pawns are crushing every minor piece. They are ineffective. Now, one of the things you have to be careful of here, I would say, playing as black, is when you go with e5, you may be inviting a possible sacrifice on this square, because white can follow up with a couple captures here in c6. This is how it plays out in the game. So in other words, your knight can be kicked from e5. That's what we have in this game. Is there a sacrifice on e5 here? This is something Gukesh had to probably weigh before playing e5. There is no good sacrifice on e5 in this case. Take a couple times, the knight ends up there. King e8, things are cool for team black. Also, keep in mind, this is still an idea, trapping that rook. White plays a3, cuts out the bishop b4 move. Follow up now is rook to a5, looking next to pinpoint the b pawn. White from here plays within the structure, ends up maneuvering the knight, seeing how it's just out of play. Crushed by the f6 pawn. Tries a maneuver with the knight. Computer says your best try at this point is to change the structure. It's suggesting b4. And then this idea to get in f4, trying to influence the structure. Black is still for choice here. Okay, white does not play in this way. He goes for, not b4, but knight e1, rook b5, and what do you do about the b pawn? It ends up going, or it could be captured in this game. After knight to d3, you could take the knight and then take the b2 pawn. Gukesh plays in a different way, in the best way, advances in the center. The knight's not on f6 anymore, is it? It's not defending against this idea. So black, we might say, takes advantage of this weakness, this lack of control over the center square, d4. And what is white supposed to do? In the game, it's pawn captures. If you immediately move the rook, well, this is going to end up really painful for white. e4 would be there, targeting the knight, and if the knight moves, there's d4 with the fork. Okay, so white's going to first capture on d4 in this game, and only now move the rook, but you're in a pin. And now that the captures have occurred here on d4, the e-file is opened up. What a move to have to face now. Not only are you in a pin, but right around the corner there is a discovered attack against the king once this bishop moves. Big problems here for white. You're in a pin and you cannot easily get out of the pin. Okay, what is white's try? Knight f3. You could take on a3 and say discovered check. Gukesh plays it in a different way, a simpler way. In my opinion, he just targets the pinned piece. Knight f3 to e1, and now we have bishop check. At the end of this sequence, Gukesh is going to now win the exchange. He swipes the knight. This bishop pair has won the exchange, we might say. There we go. And we got a passed pawn. White has a pawn for the exchange, but it's not really feeling like a pawn with this guy, with the a4 pawn restricting a3 and b2. Two passed pawns in the position. There goes the b pawn. A full exchange up now. Team black. C pawn runs. It's blockaded. And what are we going to do now with this pawn? We're going to look to advance it or even target the a3 pawn. White continues here with h4. If you try and play bishop f4 here, putting it in a position to maybe stop the d pawn, it could immediately be kicked with g5. So that's why it's first h4. Rook a2. And you can't save the a3 pawn. If we look at a couple ways white may try, rook c3, that's going to lead to mate. Rook a1, and it's a mate in 2 from there. And if you try knight c4, that'll run into rook c2. And what are we doing here? If you try and defend the rook, that'll run into rook e4 with a fork. And if you first exchange rooks and then play bishop f4, same story. So in short, there is no defending the a pawn. Bishop f4 in the game. There goes the a pawn, g3, getting out of the a pawn's way now. Knight c4, got one jump here on d6. It's covered really well with rook to e6. Follow-up is knight to d2. So if white tries something else, let's say moving in the forward, going to d6 check, I believe simplest here is to just take the knight with the rook. And then the knight remains in a position to sacrifice itself for the pawn. You just take, land a check, and then you're pushing through. White's going to soon have to sacrifice the rook for the promoted queen. Okay, so knight d6, nothing scary here. Knight d2 in this game. Rook b2, why not? Keep some pressure on a piece. Rook c3, we get behind our passed pawn. White blockades. This guy doesn't like being a blockader, but pretty much have to try and blockade. If you take the pawn here, this guy is going to run. No stopping it. Going to have to sacrifice a piece for that pawn shortly. So after rook a6, rook a3, and now rook c2. Let's just pause for a moment. This is a perfect position here for the rooks, the black rooks. The black rook is behind the passed black pawn and behind the passed white pawn. This is ideal. Some math to back it up. With every pawn advance, the options for the rooks increases. This could only be good news for the black rooks. From here, knight e4, king g6. Is there a better square for this guy? Perfect square. No good checks for white. This guy's certainly not going to bother him. The knight, same diagonal, one square separating it, needs 3 moves before it can land a check. The rook has his responsibility here, Mr. Blockader. Not a fun situation for white, to be sure. King g2. At this point, going after the pawn now. Knight d5, right around the corner. Any knight d6 move, you could take the pawn. No fancy knight move to follow with the discovered attack. King f3 in this game. Knight d5. Before playing this sequence, before putting this knight on d5, Gukesh had to see this little interference tactic It's knight c3 here. If you take the knight, white's promoting. Gukesh worked this one out. He said, okay, I'm just going to get rid of this dangerous c-pawn. And we're going to play this imbalance, a rook and 2 pawns versus the minors. These guys are vulnerable. All of white's pieces, and the ones I have highlighted, they're vulnerable. And the d-pawn is running fast, a step away now, preparing to next take the knight and get a queen. The knight is also pinned to the bishop. So there's no way out of this for white. What is tried is king to e2. In comes a check. And after king d1, rook b2 forces resignation. If the game continued, what is white supposed to do? There's a mate in 1 threat. And if you want to stop that with knight to e2, black can flick in a couple checks, and next up, win the knight. And from there, go after the kingside pawns. This is completely winning after move 48, rook to b2. So what did you think of this one? A couple notes here about Gukesh and his performance in this Olympiad. Really remarkable. He didn't play round 1, but he played the rest of the rounds. He went 9 out of 10, undefeated, earned 30 rating points, took team gold for India, individual gold for board 1, and had a tournament performance rating of 3,056. He is on fire and almost certainly the favorite going into this upcoming World Chess Championship against Ding Liren. Anyhow, feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe took a thing or two away. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.